Alya was born into a legacy, the kind of legacy that comes with polished boots, brass medals, and framed photos of men in uniform lining the hallway walls. Her family's lineage was steeped in military pride: grandfather, a two-star general, father, a decorated colonel, two older brothers, each walking in his pair of well-worn combat boots. The Barrington name carried weight in the defense community. It was expected, perhaps even predetermined, that Alya would follow. But no one expected her to lead. From the moment she stepped into the National Defense Academy, it was clear she was something different. Not louder, not stronger, but sharper. While others pushed to be the fastest in drills, Alya quietly broke records in strategy simulations. She wasn't just playing war games, she was rewriting them. By 25, she'd co-authored a new mapping framework that reduced insurgency casualties by 30%. Commanders spoke her name in briefings with quiet respect. In war rooms across 3 continents, her maps replaced outdated intel. Her father never said it out loud, but she saw it in his eyes. He was proud, maybe even a little in awe. But pride has conditions even in families. When her father's cancer returned, it was swift and cruel. Alya was stationed in the northern border zone, then running predictive drone campaigns. She requested a temporary leave, not because she couldn't handle the work, but because he couldn't handle the pain alone. No one fought her on paper. The leave was granted, but the judgment was unspoken, heavy in the silence between her brothers on family calls. "You're going to step down. Now," one of them asked. "You're the golden girl. Don't let emotion ruin your path," said the other. She left anyway. The hospital became her new battlefield. Days filled with chemo appointments, nights spent holding his hand as the morphine dulled the sharp edges of his fear. She trimmed his nails, read him field reports when he missed the sound of duty, and held the oxygen mask when his lungs refused to. Not one reporter covered it. No one pinned a medal on her chest for dignity. She returned to the force 6 months later, quietly, without ceremony. But something had shifted. Where once her name had drawn nods in the hallways, now there were only glances. Memos arrived late. Her assignments became administrative, peripheral. No longer on the front lines of tactical innovation, she was now liaison, support coordination, and technical oversight. Terms that looked official but felt hollow. Back at home, things weren't much better. At Thanksgiving, her uncle clinked his glass and toasted the boys in the family, highlighting her brother's recent promotions. When she cleared the plates, her aunt whispered, "How's work, dear?" Still, paperwork, right? No one remembered that she'd once led simulations that were studied by entire brigades. Someone joked, half laughing, "Alya's probably doing HR now, huh?" No one corrected them. She never spoke up about it. There was no point. Her family had mentally filed her away, the one who stepped back. Not out of weakness, but they didn't care for nuance. All they saw was that she'd left the action. The same girl who once briefed generals on asymmetric warfare was now in their eyes the one who couldn't take the heat. "She lost her edge," her cousin said once, not realizing Alya was just one room over. It stung. Not because it was cruel, but because it was so carelessly said. She wasn't angry. She was tired. Tired of the unspoken truth in her family that duty only counted when it wore a uniform in combat. That sacrifice only mattered when it was loud, bloody, and visible. What they never saw, what they never asked about, was the other kind of service. The kind that watches a man who once stood like a pillar slowly fade in a hospital bed and stays anyway. The kind that sits alone in a military archive at 2 a.m., triple-checking code for a new satellite trajectory, even when no one's watching. The kind that answers every call, solves the problems no one else wants, and doesn't demand applause. Alya didn't leave the war. She just entered a quieter battlefield, one they refused to recognize. There's a kind of heartbreak in being invisible to your people. Not hated, not rejected, just erased. When they talked about the family legacy, they listed names like they were reading from a plaque. Her name never came up. She was promising, her aunt once said with a sigh. But she fell back, lost her drive. She hadn't lost anything. She just gave her energy to something they didn't value, and in return they rewrote her story without her. But Alya never stopped writing it for herself. They forgot the maps she made. The strategies are still saving lives. They didn't know about the units that quietly thanked her by name in after-action reports. They didn't ask how many sleepless nights she still gave to the work long after the spotlight moved on. And that was okay. She didn't need them to clap. She didn't need them to understand. But one day soon, they would be forced to remember. Not because she asked them to, but because someone else would say her name loud in a room that mattered. And suddenly the silence they gave her for so long would become deafening. No welcome party, no farewell speech, just dust wind and quiet. They reassigned her to the border and no one asked why. No ceremony, no handshakes, no briefing that mattered. The email came with sterile language, deployment outpost Theta, Sector D, mission routine, support, and oversight. But anyone in the service knew what that meant. Outpost Theta wasn't just a location, it was a message. A forgotten place where good soldiers went to be forgotten too. Alya arrived with 2 duffels, 1 notebook, and no expectations. The outpost sat at the edge of a ravine, wind-blown and sun-scarred. The barracks were worn. The comms tower leaned just slightly too far to the right. The walls were lined with rust, and the air carried the smell of fried circuits and old disappointment. No one saluted when she stepped off the truck. No one even looked up. To them, she was just another paper pusher. Probably sent down from Central Command after a burnout. New major, someone muttered. Probably here to kill time until retirement. Another desk officer trying to feel important. She didn't correct them. She let them believe what they wanted. They called her Major Maytag, a nickname given to officers who spin in place and clean up nothing. It stung a little, but not in the way it used to. She'd already been erased once by her own family. These men and women were just following suit. It wasn't personal, it was a habit. And habit could be broken slowly, quietly. Alya started by waking up first. Before the bugle. Before the sun warmed the red clay ground. At 0430, she ran laps around the perimeter boots, thudding in rhythm with her breath. She didn't invite anyone to join. She didn't need to. By 0530, she was in the training yard alone, rebuilding from scratch, rifle drills, tactical scenarios, obstacle repetition, over and over, until muscle memory replaced memory itself. They watched from a distance at first, the grunts, the rookies, even the sergeants, eyes peeking over tin coffee mugs as she reset targets by herself. One corporal whispered, "She's training for something." "But what?" The others shrugged. Old habits die hard. At night, she stayed up after lights out. Not at the bar. Not playing cards in the mess. Not scrolling old photos like so many of them did when no one was watching. Alya sat at the back of the communications trailer beneath dim LED lighting, surrounded by cables and static. Her laptop was open not for email, but for maps, data logs, enemy movement archives, drone signal patterns. Most officers in her position stopped reading mission reports after hours. But Alya had never been most officers. Something wasn't adding up. She could feel it. A pattern was forming, but it was buried. So subtle it didn't trip the alarms. Convoy ambushes that were too precise. Enemy movements that mimicked patrol schedules down to the minute. Her instinct stirred someone's feeding them intel. But she didn't speak it aloud. Not yet. Not without proof. Weeks passed. Slowly the mood began to shift. She didn't command. She didn't lecture. She just showed up. Every day. When one of the junior officers broke down after a patrol gone wrong, Alya found him smoking alone behind the barracks. She didn't offer advice. She sat with him in silence. He cried once, then never again. When the kitchen's backup generator failed, she rewired it herself quietly overnight. And when 2 soldiers were caught falsifying recon reports, she didn't reprimand them publicly. She brought them into her office, closed the door, spoke quietly, firmly, like someone who had once made her own mistakes. They emerged pale but grateful. No one understood her methods, but they worked. By month's end, training participation rose. Morale ticked up. Even the comms logs showed a dip in incident reports. The outpost hadn't changed, but Alya's presence had made the silence feel different. Less like neglect, more like preparation. One night, Sergeant Vale Gruff, skeptical knock on her door. "Major, you got a sec?" She nodded. He stepped inside, tossed a stack of files on her desk. "Been noticing something weird in the drone logs. I didn't know who'd give a damn until I saw what you were tracking. I think you're onto something. Enemy movements matching our weekly shift changes. Like clockwork." She opened the files. Her breath stilled. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. There was data, coordinates, timestamps, tells. "You've seen this too," he said quietly. Alya looked up. For the first time in months, someone saw her, not as a washed-up officer, not as a woman clinging to relevance, but as a leader, a partner in something that mattered. She nodded once. "I think we have a breach." From that night forward, she didn't train alone. The yard filled in the mornings, first Vale, then a few privates. Then, everyone. They started calling her Iron Ghost behind her back because she never raised her voice, never sought attention, but always showed up, like steel underwater. They still didn't know who she had been back when her name meant something to the brass, back when her strategy lectures echoed through Central Command. But it didn't matter. She wasn't there for reputation. She was there for the truth. And buried beneath layers of dust, encrypted files, and shifting loyalties, she had found it. The pattern. The leak. The quiet betrayal. It wasn't a war yet, but she knew it was coming. It was supposed to be a routine run, a quiet assignment through a known corridor escorting medical supplies to a forward field hospital. Nothing flashy, nothing dangerous, just a convoy and a schedule. That's what made it perfect for sabotage. The route had been cleared the day before. Recon drones reported no unusual movement. Intel confirmed the enemy hadn't breached the canyon pass in weeks. And yet, 30 minutes into the mission, everything unraveled. The ambush came not with sound, but with silence. The first explosion didn't shake the ground, it swallowed it. The second ripped through the lead transport, flipping the armored vehicle like a toy. Debris rained down. Men screamed. The radio crackled, then cut. Dust choked the air. Someone had given the enemy the exact coordinates, the exact time. It wasn't a guess. It was precision. Alya had been sitting in the second transport scanning terrain through the windshield when the blast wave knocked her sideways. Her head slammed against the window, ears ringing, vision spinning. A second later, the convoy halted in chaos. Sniper fire. Noon. "Where's the command? Where's the damn comms? Get out! Move!" The commander, a seasoned colonel from Central, had been riding in the first vehicle. When they pulled him from the wreckage, his left leg was mangled bone visible through torn uniform. Blood pooled fast. He was conscious just long enough to whisper fallback protocol. Take command. Then he passed out cold. But no one moved. The squad froze not from fear, but from confusion. Orders weren't clear. Lines of authority blurred. No backup, no clear extraction route. Just panic. A junior lieutenant glanced around and said it out loud. "Who's in charge now?" They turned to Alya. Not because she was the highest rank she wasn't, not because she'd called attention to herself she hadn't. But in that moment of disarray, there was something in her eyes that steadied them. Not a command. Not ego. Clarity. She didn't shout. She didn't reach for a radio that no longer worked. She crouched beside the wounded colonel, pressed 2 fingers to his neck, pulse faint, but holding. Then she scanned the horizon, the rocks above the gnarled pass behind them. And she spoke one sentence. "We don't retreat. We shift." Some stared. Through the canyon's west split, she continued. "It's narrower, no drone coverage there. But I've studied that terrain. We can move a single file low visibility. If we keep to the shadows, we'll be out of their sight lines by dusk." Someone muttered, "We don't even know if that path's clear." Alya looked him dead in the eyes. "We don't know anything anymore. But we do know staying here is a death sentence. You can come with me. Or you can wait and hope they miss twice." And then she stood up and walked. Not away, forward. No one questioned her after that. The convoy split into smaller units carrying wounded on stretchers made from tarps and steel rods. Ammunition was rationed and signals were kept to hand gestures. No light, no chatter. Every step is calculated. They moved for hours up jagged inclines across loose shale and into darkness. Some stumbled, some bled. But they kept going because she did. Even when the temperature dropped. Even when the radios hissed with nothing but static. Even when they heard shots echo behind them, proof that the enemy was still chasing shadows. She never once looked back. They reached the outpost perimeter just before dawn, bruised, bloodied, exhausted, but alive. All of them. The debrief took place 36 hours later. The colonel was stable but unconscious. Medics confirmed internal trauma, likely from a blunt force impact. Half the squad had suffered minor injuries, but the real trauma wasn't physical. It was systemic. During rest, Alya returned to the comms room. Quietly, like she always did. But this time she wasn't alone. Sergeant Vale appeared at her shoulder with a thumb drive. I pulled this from the convoy log. It shouldn't exist. She raised an eyebrow. A duplicate signal was transmitted from HQ. He continued. Encrypted coordinates. Not just the route, but the convoy speed personnel list. Everything. She took the drive, inserted it. And there it was. A mirrored data packet, time-stamped the night before the mission was sent from a secure uplink within Central Command. That's why they were waiting for us, she murmured. Vale nodded. This was never a random ambush. She didn't take it public, not yet. She collected what she needed, logs, transmissions, troop placement, overlays, timestamps, and compiled them in silence. She didn't seek approval. She didn't even request a formal inquiry. Because she knew how that worked. They would bury it before it breathed. Instead, she secured the files, logged them in a personal hard drive backed by a secondary encrypted key. One day she would deliver it to the only person who could act without being stopped. But for now, she waited. That night, the outpost dining hall was quiet. Soldiers whispered about what she'd done, how she'd guided them out with nothing but instinct and grit. They called her the Shadow Compass. She sat at the corner table alone, picking at a plate of cold rice and eggs as the murmurs grew. No one cheered, no one clapped. But they watched her now with something they hadn't given before. Trust. The next morning, a small note was left on her desk. Unmarked. Just 5 words. You kept us breathing. J. She folded it carefully and tucked it inside her field manual between a page that read, Authority is earned when leadership refuses to run. There was no ceremony waiting for her. No medal. No standing ovation. Only a summons. A formal curt directive. Report to Central Command Room 614 0900. Internal Review Committee. No subject line, no details. But everyone knew what Room 614 meant. It was the room without windows. Alya arrived in uniform, perfectly pressed, no makeup, hair tied back like always. She carried nothing but a sealed folder in her left hand. The hallway outside the room was lined with polished stone and silence. Security guards nodded, but didn't smile. She could feel the weight behind the steel-reinforced doors, not just hierarchy, but judgment. Inside a long rectangular table stretched across the room, at least 8 officers in full regalia. A few faces she recognized, one general who used to ask her about mapping theory years ago, another colonel who never remembered her name. At the head sat Major General Leland, head of internal operations. To his right, a civilian oversight advisor. To his left, 2 intelligence analysts and a legal representative. There was no chair for her, just a standing space, facing them. Major Alya Barrington Leland began without looking up. Thank you for coming. It wasn't a thank you. It was an obligation wrapped in formality. He glanced at a report on the table. We've reviewed the debrief from Outpost Theta. Your name appears repeatedly, notably about decisions made outside the chain of command. Another officer cut in. Why didn't you yield authority to the next in line? A third added. Your actions, while arguably effective, were unauthorized and potentially destabilizing. You risked further ambush. You bypassed protocol. You created disorder. Disorder. She'd led a wounded unit through a sniper-filled canyon with zero support and brought every soldier home alive, and they called it disorder. But Alya didn't flinch. She didn't interrupt. She didn't defend herself. She simply placed the folder on the table, unsealed it, slid it forward, and said quietly, "I have something for the record." They opened it. First page, a heat map showing troop movement patterns. Second, a log of signal duplications. Third, transmission metadata timestamps from a classified central command relay. Fourth, an audio recording transcript. Not hers, but a voice-comm mail issuing location coordinates with time signatures that match the ambush. Every page was labeled, indexed, time-stamped. There was no anger in her voice, no bitterness, only, "I believe this was an internal leak." The coordinates were passed 2 hours before the attack. The data came from your servers, and the voice on the tape, "He has clearance above mine." No one spoke for a long moment. Even the legal officer stopped writing. Then General Leland narrowed his eyes. "Are you accusing someone from this room of treason?" She didn't blink. "I'm not accusing anyone. I'm presenting facts. You can draw your own conclusions." Silence rippled across the table. No one met her gaze. Then, a chair scraped. Someone stood. Commander Rashid. Tall, quiet, decorated. A combat leader with 30 years in field ops. He had arrived late, unnoticed, and seated at the back of the room until now. He stepped forward slowly, looked at every person in that room, one by one, and then with a voice so even, it cut the air like a blade, he said, "You want to know who was in command that night?" He pointed to her. She was. No one interrupted him. "Our convoy was compromised. I was critically wounded. My XO froze. Comms were dead. The protocol was useless. I'd led troops through 3 deployments, and I've never seen a breakdown that fast." He paused. His tone sharpened. "And if she hadn't stepped in without asking for permission, without hesitation, we'd all be dead." He turned to General Leland. "So if this committee wants to lecture her about crossing boundaries, maybe we should thank her for crossing the right ones." No one moved. "Because if Major Barrington hadn't made that call," Rashid continued, voice rising slightly, "I wouldn't be standing here. And you wouldn't have anyone left to interrogate." The room changed after that. Not immediately, not obviously. But Alya saw it. How the general's pen stopped tapping. How the legal officer slowly closed his laptop. How 2 of the analysts suddenly found it difficult to make eye contact. For the first time in years, no one was questioning her competence. No one was asking her to prove her worth. Because someone they couldn't ignore had said the truth out loud. She led the mission. She saved them. And she brought the truth back with her. The review ended early. Leland didn't apologize. But he didn't charge her either. "We'll be in touch," he said coldly, as if the facts on the table hadn't just burned through every layer of political protection. She nodded once, then turned to leave. As she reached the doorway, someone muttered under their breath, almost involuntarily, "That's her, the one who walked them out." Outside the hall was brighter than when she'd entered. The silence didn't weigh the same. She walked past 2 lieutenants who snapped to attention, not because protocol demanded it, but because respect did. In her hand, she still held 1 copy of the evidence. She'd brought 2. The other stayed on the table. No medals, no headlines, no apology. But this time, no one dared look away. The headlines didn't say her name. No front-page photo, no press conference, no morning talk show discussing her decisions. In a media landscape that thrived on controversy and scandal, her victory was too quiet, too clean. It didn't bleed, so it didn't lead. But inside secure walls, her name began to move. It appeared on documents stamped classified. It appeared in quiet conversations behind closed doors where seasoned generals whispered her name with equal parts caution and respect. and it appeared finally undeniably on an official letter of promotion signed by the Secretary of Defense. Effective immediately, Major Alya Barrington is appointed to the rank of Brigadier General, assuming full command over counterintelligence and asymmetric threat strategy across the Southern Command region. The highest position ever granted to someone who had once been written off as a quiet admin, as a woman too loyal to duty and not loud enough for attention. But Alya didn't smile when she received the news. She didn't cry either. She simply folded the letter in half, slid it into her bag, and went back to her desk. When the planning committee reached out to organize her pinning ceremony, the formal induction, the media ops, the stage lights, and photo opportunities, her response was swift, declined. The aide on the other end of the line paused, confused. "General, it's tradition. The secretary herself was planning to attend. There'll be a citation." A speech Alya cut in softly but firmly. "I'm not here to give speeches. I'm here to work." So there was no applause, no trumpet, no champagne, just a plain envelope on her desk the following Monday. Inside it, a single silver star wrapped in velvet. Her new rank. She placed it gently inside a drawer, closed it, and opened her field map. The office she'd been given wasn't much. A converted storage room on the third floor of Southern Command HQ tucked between a vacant briefing suite and a utility closet. The walls where bare paint was slightly chipped near the floorboards. The ventilation hummed with faint static. She liked it that way. It reminded her of the outpost, of Theta, of where the work had always been real. One wall in the room was entirely covered with a tactical map of the region, not the decorative kind handed out at briefings. This one was lived in, marked, updated by hand. On it were dozens of pins, red ones mostly. Each red pin marked a location where intelligence had either failed or been silenced. Places that still held questions no one wanted to ask. Patterns that didn't make the news. Lives that vanished with no explanation. She didn't see statistics when she looked at that map. She saw faces, boots, radios gone dark, soldiers walking into traps with bad data and good faith. This was what no one celebrated: the invisible war. Not fought with bullets, but with whispers, manipulations, digital ghosts, and betrayals in fluorescent-lit buildings. Her war. Now, her command. Within weeks of taking office, Alya rewrote the protocols for how threat data was cross-verified. She installed a 3-point review system for field intel bypassing traditional hierarchy to eliminate bottlenecks. She launched silent audits of communication traffic stretching back 5 years, scrubbing, testing, comparing. No one could say exactly what she was doing, but they knew something had changed. Response times got faster. Misdirected missions dropped by half. Remote bases reported clearer guidance, more accurate support. A dozen compromised agents were quietly extracted from zones where they had been unknowingly exposed. She didn't issue memos announcing these results. She never said "told you so." But every field officer in the Southern Division began to repeat a new phrase among themselves. She sees things others miss. A few months into the role, an intern named Mason, fresh out of Georgetown, smart and eager, was assigned to her operations unit. He asked one day hesitantly while helping her sort through coded reports, "General, if you don't mind me asking, why here?" She looked up surprised by the question. "Here. Yeah. I mean, you could have asked for any post. Pentagon, Overseas Command, Joint Task Force. But this place? It's small. No press. No political lift." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned toward the map on the wall. Let the silence fill the room. Then finally, "Because this is where they stop looking." She pointed at the cluster of red pins. "That's where I start." Mason didn't ask again. Visitors came and went, officials in dress blues, analysts, with folders tucked under their arms, officers offering updates on regional threats. Some tried to shake her hand with performative enthusiasm. Some tested her phrased things in ways that sought weakness. She offered them nothing but clarity, a single tone, a single sentence. If it's not helping, the mission, don't bring it into the room. They learned quickly. You didn't bring drama to her door. You brought intel, solutions, or you didn't come at all. And yet, beneath the steel of her tone, something lived. She still took time to write thank you notes. Real ones, in ink. She still remembered the birthdays of her team, quietly leaving a card on their desks before sunrise. She still kept a list taped behind her cabinet door, a handwritten column of every name lost in the breach she survived and every name she helped bring home after. Not for show, for balance. They never wrote her story in the newspapers. But one day, an anonymous post appeared on an internal military forum used by junior field officers. It read, "She turned down the podium, but gave us back our footing. She doesn't need the spotlight. She makes her maps." The road home felt different now. Not because it had changed, it hadn't. The fields were still stitched in gold and green, scattered with barns that leaned slightly with age. The houses still carried the dust of generations, and the same rusty mailbox still sat at the end of her family's gravel drive, crooked and faithful. But Alya had changed. She hadn't been back in over 2 years. Not since the funeral. Not since the day everyone stood to honor her father, except of course the family who'd once whispered about her failure behind closed doors. No one had asked where she'd gone. No one had looked closely enough to see that she'd been rising. But today wasn't about proving anything. Today was something else. She parked outside the old farmhouse. The porch creaked beneath her boots just like it used to when she was a teenager sneaking out after curfew. A wind chime she remembered from childhood still hung beside the door, bent, missing one metal strand, but singing anyway. Her uncle stepped out before she knocked. He looked older, a little smaller, as if time had quietly peeled back the edges of the man who once told her, in a room full of relatives, that her place was better behind a desk than behind a rifle. For a moment he just stood there, holding his breath. Then he bowed his head. It wasn't dramatic. There were no grand apologies, just a nod, a moment of gravity, a kind of surrender, and that was enough. Inside the house smelled like cinnamon and dust. Her aunt was at the kitchen counter folding laundry that had no owner anymore. Her cousins stood in the living room holding coffee cups they didn't drink from. No one said much, until one of them, a cousin named Julia, the same one who'd once laughed when Alya was reassigned, stepped forward. She held something in her hand. A clipping, a printed-out page, not from a newspaper, but from a military briefing leak passed around among officers, shared in whispers. At the top, Southern Division Counterintelligence Command Transition, Barrington A. Julia looked at it, then at Alya. "I didn't know," she whispered. None of us did. We thought you'd just disappeared. I'm sorry." Alya didn't say, "It's okay," because it wasn't. But she also didn't say, "I told you so." She simply nodded. Forgiveness doesn't always have to be spoken. She left the house before dusk and walked the familiar path behind the farm, the same dirt trail her father used to walk with her every Sunday. Back then, he'd bring a compass and a folded topographic map instead of fairy tales. Where other girls were told stories of castles and dragons, she learned about coordinates, terrain, shadows, and how to find true north when everything else failed. "You always know where you are," he used to say, tapping the map, "if you know where you come from." That trail ended at the family plot, a row of stone markers behind a low iron gate, simple, modest, nothing about rank or medals. Her father's grave sat beneath the only tree on the hill. She approached quietly as if her footsteps could still wake him. She knelt in front of the headstone, reached into her coat pocket, and pulled out a velvet box. Inside, her newly minted silver star, the mark of her rise to brigadier general. No spotlight, no crowd. Just the metal and her hand and the weight of what it meant. She placed it gently at the base of the headstone and whispered, "I didn't give up. I just took the long way around." There was no voice in return, no wind lifting dramatically, no cinematic cue, only the stillness of evening, the rustle of leaves, the sense quiet deep that he already knew. She stood and looked out at the land below, at the village, the rooftops, the fading light catching the tips of the wheat fields. Not long ago, she thought she'd lost this place. That home had closed its doors to her. But it hadn't. It had just waited. On her way back down the path, she passed 2 kids playing near the old fence. One of them, mud on her jeans, bruised knees, wild hair, stopped and stared. "Are you in the army?" the girl asked. Alya paused, then smiled. Something like that. Did you win something? She looked back toward the tree, then down at her empty hand. Not exactly, she said. But I didn't lose either. The girl nodded as if that made perfect sense, and ran off. That night, Alya slept in her childhood room. Same wallpaper, same tiny desk, same a crack in the ceiling that looked like a lightning bolt if you turned your head the right way. She didn't unpack her bag. She wouldn't be staying long. But for the first time in years, she rested without weight, without needing to prove, without needing to fight. Home hadn't changed much. But the girl who left, she had returned a woman who could walk straight through silence and leave it softer behind her. She never appeared on television. There were no documentaries made in her honor. No interviews were conducted where she sat under warm lighting to recount her story. No awards show where someone read her accomplishments into a microphone while an audience clapped politely. She declined every request, politely, firmly. Alya Barrington didn't need the world to remember her. She just needed the right people not to forget. Her office remained the same after the promotion, still tucked between a storage closet and a briefing room that no one used. Still small, still quiet. The only luxury she allowed herself was a larger map on the wall, one that spanned the Southern Command region. From the outermost surveillance towers to the hills, no satellite could see clearly. Every red pin marked a place she'd studied. Every faded blue marker showed a path no longer safe. And in between, she charted her corridors unofficial, unlisted, but built from instinct and hard-won data. The maps never lied. But they required someone who could read between the lines. Every week, a new situation report would arrive on her desk. Unit Alpha missing 2 days past the checkpoint. Unit. Rescue Bravo coordinates unknown suspected trapped in hostile valley. Convoy Echo contact lost dust storm interference likely. Others might panic. Others might call it a briefing. Build a panel, draw arrows across a whiteboard. Alya worked alone. She would close the door, turn off the overhead light, turn on the desk lamp, instead the same one she'd taken with her from Outpost Theta. Then she'd open the last known location, compare satellite data, cross-reference with transmission trails, and always quietly, patiently, she'd mark a path. Not the obvious one, the one that worked. Within hours, the stranded unit would receive a direct transmission. No grand explanations, just a single file, an extraction route. Clean, short, precise, marked with terrain notes, estimated time, and fallback options. There were no credits at the bottom, no signature. Just the metadata tag. OP Barrington direct soldiers in the field began calling them ghost maps, because they always showed up at the right time when things felt lost. And they always worked. A commander once joked in a debrief, "She doesn't lead troops, she leads out of chaos." A rookie lieutenant called it something else. "She sends us instructions like prayers, like someone up there is still thinking about us." They never saw her, but they trusted her. And in war, that was everything. Her team, small by design, grew to understand her rhythm. They learned not to interrupt when her door was closed. They learned that silence didn't mean absence. And they learned most of all that the woman behind the wall of maps never asked for praise but carried responsibility like it was something sacred. In the corner of her office next to the encrypted server bank, there was a small framed note, a handwritten message, yellowing around the edges now but still clear. "She never failed. We just failed to see her." It was signed simply Rashid. She never spoke about that note. She never mentioned the day Rashid placed it on her desk, months after the committee hearing, after everything had changed. He didn't say a word when he gave it to her, just handed it over and walked away. But she'd kept it ever since. Not as a trophy, as a reminder of how easy it was to overlook what doesn't shout, and how dangerous that blindness could become. Once a young officer asked her if she ever missed command in the traditional sense, the field, the adrenaline, the voice yelling over gunfire leading the charge. Alya smiled, not unkindly. "Command isn't about volume," she said. "It's about clarity. I don't need to be seen. I need them to make it home." Over time, those she helped began to return. Some sent thank you notes. Some sent photos. One unit, after surviving a 6-day entrapment, mailed her a patch they designed themselves a compass with no needle, just the word, trust. She pinned it beside the map, but never spoke about it. Eventually, others started calling her office the last room, because when every plan failed, when every known route broke down, when no one else had answers, they knew where to go. Not for hope, for direction. And Alya never failed to offer one, not because she was perfect, but because she had been lost once too. And she had promised herself silently, irrevocably, that no one else would have to walk through that silence alone again. There's a kind of legacy that never shows up in parades. It lives in unmarked files, quiet rooms, lives saved that we'll never know by who. And somewhere between map pins and midnight radio signals, Major General Alya Barrington built hers. Not in spotlight, but in shadows, where direction mattered more than recognition, where truth and not applause was the final reward.